Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm George Binns, and I'm here with my co-host, Elliot Margolis, and we're interviewing or discussing the climate change situation with Frank Bellini. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you very much, George.
Glad give you credit for your courage to come back for a second appearance. Yeah.
That's nice.
So, from your background as a geologist and a climate scientist, from a professional point of view, what's your take on climate science or climate change?
Well, it would be as a geologist and an environmental scientist. Climate science is a very, very new science. We used to think geology was a new science because it originated in the 1800s. Climate science originated in the 1990s, and in some parts there's a lot to it, in other parts there isn't much to it. I don't have much to say about what is currently constituted as climate science, other than to say I don't like it. I think it's based on a lot of false premises and unsubstantiated assumptions. So I will show you some real data today, some real Earth data, some real measurements that not just tend to pull the foundation out from under what we think of as climate science, but actually take it right apart. So whenever you're ready.
So what the fundamental question is, what is a climate change? How is that different from a shift in the weather patterns?
Well, climate is long-term weather, to define it very loosely and very succinctly. Climate shifts, as I'll show you in some of my slides, have occurred for as long as the Earth has existed, 4 billion years, and certainly have been very significant for as long as life has existed on Earth in large, plentiful abundance, which has been about 600 million years. So it's probably most instructive to look back over the last 800 million years or so and see that we've had at least 4, if not 8 or 10 continental glaciations of the North America in particular and Asia, and show that on its own, naturally, climate flips back and forth from cold to warm to a great degree, to a degree which would freeze you or make you very hot, depending on which end of the spectrum you were on.
Well, from my perspective, I think back that within what we call civilized times, dates back to the end of the last glaciation period, which is about 15,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. We've had some really significant changes. The Younger Dryas is the first one, where the glaciers came back for another 1,500 years, and we had the medieval warming, where the range of growing wheat moved 100 miles north, and it wiped out Rome's breadbasket, which was Tunisia. And in this day and age, I think it's hard for people to recognize that, hey, Tunisia used to grow wheat very, very popularly and supported the Mediterranean. And the little ice age, the one I like about that is it ended in 1814, because that was the last year they had the winter carnival on the frozen Thames River outside of London. So there are some dramatic ones that you can instantly see as, oh, that's different. Or the greatest one of them all, I guess, is the greening of the Sahara Desert and then turning it back into a desert over 5,000 years. So there are some really dramatic ones that at least I think of as that is a climate change. And yeah, it's a little different now than it was maybe 20, 30 years ago around here. but is that significant enough? And that's the problem I have, is what's really significant, because everybody's talking about it as a great horror story that's going to wipe out all mankind and half the animals in the world.
Well, you have to ask yourself, how will it wipe us out? The first idea and the thing that everyone fears is a rise in sea level. And if you look at historic sea level trends, which is the sort of the first concept that I have here to talk about, they are the same as they were in the Abraham Lincoln administration. And you can look all around the world, and anywhere where you have a good tidal gauge, meaning that the land is not either rising or subsiding, like it is in some places. But if you have a good stable land mass and an ocean up against it, and you measure ocean levels long term, you can go to the NOAA website, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, a U.S. agency, and you can get their charts. And the charts show that sea level rise is active all over the world, but the rate at which sea level is rising is well under a foot every 100 years, and that the rate of rise is basically the same everywhere. You're talking a few millimeters to a foot over 100 years. I went to a presentation by the high school here in Gloucester about a year or two ago, and these poor kids were up there predicting 3 and 4 and 5 foot sea level rises over the next 100 or 200 years. And I stood up at the end and told them how absurd I thought it was, and the teacher was really not interested in speaking with me afterwards, but unfortunately. But that's the way it is. Let me show you a couple of charts on sea level rise, if I can share my screen with you.
Okay.
Okay. You got to authorize me, right? Under share screen, and I think there's a little box beside that that says allow everyone to share. Okay, I'm still not getting an allowance to share here.
Is that George that has to allow that?
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, so you can see the data from the battery, New York?
Not yet.
Not
Not
yet.
yet. Okay, okay.
There
There
we
it
go.
is. Yep.
Okay, great. So this is a typical NOAA chart, and the battery is short for Battery Park, which is at the south tip of Manhattan. And these data go back to the 1850s, and you can see the straight line trend. There's absolutely no inflection point. There's nothing going on here that isn't absolutely natural, in my opinion. And it's very similar to one that you could pull up from the NOAA site for Boston, Massachusetts, which is the closest one to the North Shore here. This is what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission referred us to when we asked them how should we factor in sea level rise in the design of flood protection for East Seacoast nuclear power plants. And we said, is this all? Because, you know, people tell us that sea level is really rising more than this, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission said, no, your nuclear power plant will be safe if you just factor in this small incremental rise. And I don't know whether you can read it up here, but it's 0.09 millimeters per year. And in terms of feet per 100 years, that's about 9/10 of a foot in 100 years. Here is another one. This one's from Sydney, Australia. And basically you see the same thing. You see a straight line trend, a little bit of a rise here, less 0.65 millimeters per year. And this is typical of the Pacific Ocean. I don't know why it's a little lower. It could be that land is shifting relative to sea level at this location. And then finally, here's one from Honolulu, Hawaii, which shows basically the same thing, but some smart fella has plotted a CO2, atmospheric CO2 concentration curve on here. And you can't read these numbers over here, but it goes from above 400 parts per million here to under 3 to about 350 parts per million here. So it's been rising quite dramatically. You don't see quite the dramatic rise. I'll show you in another slide how dramatic, in fact, it is. But you can see that the CO2 just has no effect. You know, here it is beginning to rise here in the 60s and 70s pretty dramatically. It has no effect on sea level. So if indeed CO2 is warming the atmosphere, which I don't believe it is, it's having no effect on the ice caps. It's not melting them.
Well, the other half of the game that I think too many people miss is the Arctic and the Antarctic are totally different. The Arctic is an open ocean.
Yep.
And when it freezes, the ice is floating on the ocean.
Right.
And there's a little experiment you could do with in high school.
There's no land
Middle
underneath
school,
it.
where you get a glass of water, fill it right to the brim with an ice cube in it, and you wait until the ice cube melts, and it doesn't overflow.
Right.
Now, the Antarctic is different. Antarctic is a landmass with glaciers sitting on top of it.
Yep. And
all glaciers have a habit of moving downhill. And pieces of it continue to flow towards, and that's really what happens. The glacier flows. They happen to flow towards the ocean, and they drop pieces off, and they make icebergs. And yeah, those are the ones that will have an effect on the ocean level because they aren't floating before they hit the water.
Yeah. Well, the point here is sea level rise is not a problem. Now, looking back in time here a little bit further on this chart, you have this straight line piece, which is the time frame that the other charts are showing. And then back here in the early 1800s and into the 1700s, you had a lot going on. Now, it's hard to get good data back in here. You don't have measurements the way you do hand measurements, the way you do here in the post 1850 part of the graph. But in general, it's showing pretty stable sea level. Now, if we take it back one step further, as you said, at the end of the glacial period, it was about 12,000 years ago, there was about 5,000 feet of glacial ice over our heads where we're sitting right now. All that ice, excuse me, all that ice eventually melted. But while it was frozen solid, sea level was down about 340 feet. So when you look at some of those nice National Geographic maps that have these canyons through the continental shelf and slope, those were rivers in those days. You can see one off of the Hudson River as it flows out of New York City, a really big one, a pretty good size canyon that's there. And that was eroded, not underwater, but that was eroded in the dry when the glaciers took all the water up from the earth and lowered sea level. You have to understand that when the glaciers melted, there were torrents of water released. And the climate continued to change over that 10,000 years to what we have now, where it's development of continental glaciers is no longer a function of the earth.
Well, that's one of the other things that surprises me when you look into some of the other anecdotal data. During World War II, a flight of P-38s was heading towards Europe, and they crash landed on the glacier in Greenland, got caught in a storm. And in 1993 or 4, I forget the exact date, somebody decided, let's go back and get those planes and refurbish them. Well, they had to dig through about 300 feet of ice, not snow, ice, to get to them because the glacier on Greenland continues to form.
That's
and
right.
Pieces of it flow down to the sea and break off, and they melt back from the sea level. And people get all nervous and jerky about one little piece of data when, hey guys, in the real world, it ain't much different than it used to be. Glaciers still form when the snow falls. And we get snow every winter.
Right.
Now, Frank, you started this conversation off by saying that, you know, we had glaciers thousands and thousands of years ago, but it's the atmospheric pressure or the rotation of the earth and its in position towards the sun that has actually changed the way the heating of the earth. And so my question is, if that's true, what can we do about it?
Wow. The real answer is not much. I'm going to show you another slide here, this figure 7 that I have up. This goes back 800,000 years, so almost a million years, Elliot. And you can see the swings in temperature. This is about a 10-degree range Celsius right here, which is about a 50-degree range Fahrenheit. That's a lot of change for an average temperature. And how many times it has swung from warm to cold, and in particular, the last 4 cold periods. These are the European names for them, but we call them the Kansan, Nebraskan, Illinoisan, and Wisconsin glaciations down in here. So we've glaciated in the last 500 million years, 500,000 years, 4 times, and they've remelted without any help from man whatsoever. Well, man really didn't even exist as a significant animal on Earth until a few hundred years ago, let alone back hundreds of thousands of years like this. So this is a natural cycle that's happening right here on Earth right now. And you mentioned sun, the impact of the sun. It appears, if I can find the right one here, yeah, sure. For a long, long time, we have been observing sunspots. And it turns out that sunspots are an indication of the heat level of the sun, the amount of heat that the sun is giving off. Back in the 1700s, a guy by the name of Milankovitch, some Polish guy, I think, Milankovitch was looking at the cycles, and these blue lines here that go up and down are called Milankovitch cycles, and taking a look at how the swings might be from high amounts of sunspots to low amounts of sunspots. Well, now we know that sunspots are an indication of how much heat the sun is giving off, and so how much heat the Earth is receiving from the sun. There have been long-term cycles. There's about 11-year cycle in these Milankovitch cycles that goes from cold to warm. There are also longer-term cycles as shown on this, and the black line here is kind of an average temperature line. The shaded part over here on the right side of the diagram is a prediction, and as such, I don't know what the assumptions are. I don't know what the inputs are for this, but what the typical prediction is from people who do this kind of work is that we'll have another Maunder minimum coming up, moving into the 22nd century, the end of the 21st and the 22nd, and it will get cold. It will get very cold again. So I think that's what you're referring to. Does that answer your question?
Well, it does. I mean, so it's like a natural event. And, I mean, I'm hearing things like the number of buildings that we build has an effect on climate change. The number of people have an effect on climate change because of carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, what can we do to stop it? And you got to build buildings. So modernization is what's making climate change allegedly faster than normal.
Yeah.
Would that be a fair statement?
No.
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 Well,
So let me show you.
basically, the problem comes down to one of people use the words very sloppily. And what you're getting into is the fact that we've been in an ice age, the real ice age, for something like 2.5 million years. And the ice age is characterized by repeated cycles of glaciation. The glaciers grow and they shrink back, and they grow and they shrink back. And
right, these
the
things.
cycles on the glaciations is about 110,000 years between them. And we usually get about a 15-year warm spell between 15,000-year warm spell between the glaciation periods. And that's what we're in now.
That's where we are now. That's right.
So basically, I'm all in favor of global warming. If it can push off the next glaciation period for a few more years, hey, I'm happy with that. Like Frank said earlier, where we're sitting right now talking about this was under a mile of ice 22,000 years ago.
12,000. Yep.
Well, you have to get into the maximum of it. 12,000 years ago was the second glaciation. After
12,000 was the beginning of melting.
Well, that was the end of. That was sort of the end of the Younger Dryas period.
If you look at the high temperature here that we're currently in, and you look back at the last 3 out of the last 4 glaciations, the intraglacial warm period was warmer than it is now.
Yeah. So there's a prediction that if we do nothing, it's going to get warmer anyway, because that's what it is.
Entirely possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. We won't be around for the next one, thank goodness. But this appears to be the cycle now. Why it changed from this cycle over here with lower warming to higher warming is really anybody's guess.
Well, again,
I don't know. But what alarms people is this, or what the warmists, I like to call them, who are all alarmists, have you take a look at. This is the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, and you can see how it's been going up. Now, these measurements are taken out of sediment cores and ice cores from up to 1,000 years ago or so. These are measurements from the Mauna Loa Observatory, quantitative measurements of how much CO2 gas there is in the atmosphere. So these are good measurements. Now you can see drawing it this way as opposed to the other graph that I showed you makes it look very intimidating, like it's never going to stop. Well, you have to look at the y-axis. Down here we were at 280 parts per million. Now we're up in the 420 or so, 30 parts per million. But that is a minuscule amount of the atmosphere. CO2 represents 0.04% of the atmosphere. And the amount of added CO2 from man represents 0.01, this whole thing, 0.01% of the atmosphere. That is not the control knob that controls the temperature of a planet, in my opinion.
Just out of curiosity, because we're running out of time already. It's unbelievable. This is fascinating.
Yeah.
But the new Green Deal that AOC is suggesting, if that was totally implemented, would that have an effect?
No,
Yeah.
no. You're shoveling against the tide here.
Well, that was my point, basically. That
You're shoveling against the tide. You can't stop this stuff, and you can't start it.
Well, that's the other half of the game, is you ask somebody, what causes the atmosphere to go into a glaciation period, and what causes it to come out of one?
What's
Nobody's
behind
got
you?
the foggiest idea.
It's what behind you in this picture, clouds. It's water vapor. Water vapor has an effect on atmospheric warming orders of magnitude more than CO2 does. CO2 has a very minor, tiny little effect. Take a look at this temperature data. This is what the warmists struggle with. This is temperature data going back to the mid-1990s. There hasn't been any warming. We call this the pause, and they can't explain it.
No.
It's some sort of natural phenomenon where whatever warming there was between 1950 or so and 1990s has stopped. And as hard as we work pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, we can't get it to warm up anymore, even if we were trying.
Well, basically what it comes down to is, like you mentioned earlier, CO2 is a small percentage of the atmosphere.
Minuscule.
And
Yep.
without an atmosphere, the planet Earth would have an average temperature around 0 degrees F. And we're getting about 60 degrees of warming from our atmosphere. And if you look at the rate of change of CO2, it is practically increased by 50%. And yet all we're getting is a theoretical 1 degree C rise.
Yeah,
It is not
if
a
that.
big swinger.
If
And
that.
as Elliot says, we're running out of time, and this is one of these kinds of discussions I think we ought to continue again, because there's just so much information.
If I could make just one more point, the economic point. This graph shows from 1800 to current 2020, the burning of hydrocarbons, the rate at which we're burning hydrocarbons, the blue line. The upper trend of dots is the improved status of people, the improved economies, the improved living styles as a result of being able to burn coal and oil on a large scale, generate power, generate heat. The red dots here is a representation of extreme poverty in the world. And you can see how burning coal has made extreme poverty take a nosedive. If you try and stop CO2 emissions, if you try and turn this curve downward, these poor people here are going to have tremendous problems all over the world.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully you get the whole show on the BevCam, but this is a discussion that I think needs to go on continuously, because as Elliot mentioned, AOC is pushing some really strange stuff, and Bernie Sanders is just as bad. So it's something we need to understand, and we need to be able to talk intelligently to our representatives and straighten them out. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. And if you've got a different opinion than what we've been expressing tonight, hey, my email is right behind us at the end of the show. Send me a message and we'll get you on and you can have your say. Thanks again for watching, and there'll be more of this.